Don't look down. The woman froze halfway over the shattered glass railing. One hand clawed at empty air, 50 stories of open sky waiting beneath her heels. Champagne glasses caught the light of 1,000 tiny bulbs strung along the terrace, and for a moment the entire skyline seemed to tilt sideways with her. Buildings and stars and headlights, blurring into a single smear of gold. The wind cut sideways across the rooftop terrace, carrying the sound of a string quartet that had not yet stopped playing, as if the world below refused to believe what was happening above it. Somewhere behind her, a glass shattered against the floor, and a woman's scream rose thin and useless into the night air, swallowed almost instantly by the roar of the wind funneling between the towers. Then a stranger in a gray maintenance jacket lunged through the crowd of tailored suits and diamond earrings, moving faster than anyone dressed like him had any right to move, his shoulder clipping a waiter's tray and sending a spray of champagne across the concrete without a single glance back. He caught her wrist a heartbeat before her fingers slipped from the broken frame, his grip closing like a vice built from years no one in that crowd could have imagined. "Hold on," he said, his voice flat, almost bored, the kind of calm that made the panic around him look foolish by comparison. She was Serafina Vale, chief executive of Vale Dominion, a woman whose name sat on skyscrapers and magazine covers and the tail fins of private jets, and in that instant she was nothing but a body dangling over the edge of her own empire. She expected him to freeze, to shout for help, to do what every other guest on that terrace was doing, which was scream and reach for a phone instead of reaching for her. Instead, he wrapped one arm around the twisted railing, read the wind in a single glance, and pulled her upward with a precision that looked less like instinct and more like training. A security guard near the bar stopped mid-sentence, stared at the way the man's body had braced itself against the metal, and said the words that would follow Malcolm Vance for the rest of that year. "That man moves like a Navy SEAL," he said, loud enough for a dozen people to hear. Malcolm slowly lifted his eyes toward the guard, said nothing at all, and went back to hauling a billionaire back over the edge of the world. The rooftop of the Vale Meridian Tower had been built for exactly this kind of party, the kind where champagne cost more than most people's rent and every guest measured their worth by who noticed them first. Serafina had stepped away from the noise to take a call in private, phone pressed to her ear, jaw tightening with every word from the other end. A merger she had spent 18 months assembling was collapsing in real time, a partner bank pulling out over rumors nobody could trace back to a source. And for the first time in years, she felt the ground of her own certainty shift beneath her. She paced toward the far railing, the one overlooking the glittering spine of the city, and pressed her palm flat against the glass, as if she could steady the deal by steadying herself. A gust of wind rolled off the water and slammed into the tower with more force than the forecast had promised, rattling the string lights overhead and sending a shiver through the crowd that most of them mistook for excitement rather than warning. Nobody heard the faint crack beneath the noise of laughter and jazz, a hairline fracture spreading through a pane of safety glass that should never have failed under normal pressure. Serafina took one step back to escape the wind, and the railing gave way beneath her hand, as if it had been waiting for exactly that moment. She fell forward instead of back, momentum betraying her, and the last thing she saw before her stomach dropped was the horrified face of a waiter who was too far away to help. In the second before she went over the edge, a man in a gray uniform who had spent the entire evening invisible against the wallpaper of wealth was already moving. Malcolm Vance was 41 years old, a contract maintenance worker for the tower, a black single father who kept his head down, his voice low, and his past locked somewhere behind a face that gave nothing away. Nobody at that party had spoken to him all night, and nobody would have remembered his name if his hands had not closed around Serafina Vale's wrist exactly when they did. He did not scream. He did not hesitate. He did not run toward the nearest exit the way 3 security guards twice his size instinctively did. Somewhere beneath the noise, and the champagne and the panicked shouting, a part of him that he had spent 3 years trying to bury woke up instantly and without permission, the old instincts rising through his chest like muscle, remembering a language his mind had tried to forget. He simply crossed the terrace in 4 long strides, planted his boot against the base of the railing, and reached into the open air, like he had done it 100 times before, in places far more dangerous than a rooftop full of investors. For one fractured second, the rooftop disappeared entirely, replaced by a different sky, a different wind, a different set of hands he had once reached for and failed to catch in time. And then, just as quickly, the memory folded itself away, and there was only the woman in front of him and the work that needed doing. Serafina hung suspended over the edge of the tower she had built her entire life around, the wind screaming past her ears, her designer heels slipping uselessly against the exterior wall. A young security guard near the bar shouted for Malcolm to wait, insisting the damaged railing would not hold the added weight of a rescue attempt, warning that any wrong move might send both of them over instead of just one. Malcolm answered without turning his head, his voice carrying none of the fear that filled every other voice on that rooftop. "I know," he said, and then he did something that made the entire crowd go silent at once. He shifted his stance, angled his hips against the twisted metal frame, and used his own body as a counterweight in a way that defied every instinct a normal man would have followed. In his mind, he had already run the calculation that mattered most, weighing Serafina's body against the wind pushing sideways across the tower, measuring the angle of her hips against the last intact section of railing still bolted to the concrete. He told her not to fight him, his tone quiet but absolute, the kind of command that people obeyed without understanding why. Serafina, dangling over 50 stories of open air, found herself obeying a stranger in a maintenance uniform without a single question in her mind. From somewhere along his belt, Malcolm produced a length of nylon cord, the kind maintenance crews carried for securing scaffolding, and looped it once around a steel support beam bolted into the floor. He shifted his grip, repositioned his feet, and pulled in one smooth motion that brought Serafina's body swinging back over the ledge and onto solid concrete. She collapsed onto the terrace floor, chest heaving, her designer gown torn at the shoulder, staring up at the man who had just rewritten the ending of her evening. "Are you hurt?" he asked, crouching beside her, checking her wrist with 2 fingers pressed lightly against her pulse, in a motion too practiced to belong to an ordinary maintenance worker. "Who are you?" Serafina finally managed to ask, her voice shaking even as her mind fought to reassert control over the moment. "I'm maintenance," Malcolm answered simply, already rising to his feet, already reaching for the radio clipped to his belt to report the failure. A few feet away, a guest in a tuxedo laughed nervously and told the small crowd gathering that the man had simply gotten lucky, that anyone could have grabbed a falling woman if they happened to be standing close enough. Malcolm said nothing in response, his silence heavier than any argument he could have made. Serafina, still catching her breath, noticed the scars along the backs of his hands, thin white lines that did not match the calluses of a man who spent his days replacing light fixtures and unclogging pipes. A young security guard, barely out of his 20s, stepped closer and studied the way Malcolm had planted his feet during the rescue, the way he had wrapped the cord, the muscle memory in every motion. Something in the guard's expression shifted from confusion into something closer to recognition. "Have you served?" the guard asked quietly, almost afraid of the answer he suspected was coming. Malcolm turned to face him, his jaw tight, his eyes giving away nothing, and for several long seconds he offered no reply at all. The silence stretched across the terrace like a held breath, broken only by the distant wail of a siren rising from the streets below, and Serafina realized, watching the exchange, that the man who had just saved her life was hiding something far larger than a job title. Police and building security sealed off the terrace within minutes, cordoning the area with yellow tape, while paramedics checked Serafina for injuries she insisted she did not have. She wanted Malcolm to stay behind and give a statement, but he had already begun edging toward the service elevator, clearly intent on disappearing back into the anonymity he had built his entire life around. She caught up to him near the stairwell, breathless, still trembling from adrenaline, and asked him flatly how much money it would take for him to stay. Malcolm stopped walking and turned to face her, an unreadable expression crossing his features. "Excuse me?" he said, as if the question had genuinely confused him. "Money," Serafina repeated, reaching for the only currency she trusted to explain anything in her world. "I didn't save you for money," Malcolm answered, his voice quiet, but firm enough to end the conversation before it began. The response irritated her more than it should have, because in Serafina's experience, Every person who had ever helped her wanted something in return, whether it was a favor, a contract, or simply proximity to her name. She offered him a substantial bonus anyway, watched him decline it without hesitation, and finally asked what he actually wanted, if not money. "Check your railing system," Malcolm said, and something in the way he phrased it made her stomach tighten in a way the fall itself had not managed. He did not call it an accident. He called it a system, as though the failure had been engineered rather than suffered. He pointed out that the fracture pattern in the broken glass did not match ordinary wear, that the bolts along the frame showed signs of tampering rather than age, details that no maintenance worker should have been able to identify at a glance in the dark. Serafina ordered a full security review before the ambulance had even left the building, unwilling to let the observation slide past her the way she might have dismissed it from anyone else. Footage from the terrace cameras showed a masked figure near the railing nearly 20 minutes before her call, moving with clear purpose rather than curiosity, tools visible in gloved hands. A separate block of security footage covering the same corridor had been deleted entirely, the gap in the timeline too clean to be accidental. By midnight, Serafina no longer believed she had survived a random accident, and the certainty settled into her chest like a stone. She asked her head of security to locate Malcolm Vance and bring him in for a formal debrief, expecting the task to take minutes, given how thoroughly the tower vetted its contract staff. Instead, the personnel file that came back to her desk contained almost nothing at all. A name, an age, a job title, no employment history predating his arrival in the city 3 years earlier, no listed references, no record of the man existing anywhere before he had appeared to fix a broken pipe on the 12th floor. "Nobody has a file this empty," Serafina said aloud, staring at the screen in her office long after the party downstairs had ended and the guests had scattered back into their gilded lives. Her head of security shifted uncomfortably in the doorway before delivering the detail that would keep her awake until sunrise. "There's something stranger," he admitted. "His fingerprints don't exist in any system we have access to, not even the older municipal database that predates half our current employees." Serafina began watching Malcolm without his knowledge over the following days, telling herself it was simple due diligence rather than the growing curiosity she refused to name. His life, on the surface, was almost aggressively ordinary. A small apartment above a laundromat, no luxury car, no expensive watch, no assistant trailing behind him to manage a calendar that barely existed. But certain patterns emerged the longer she watched. Small habits that did not belong to a man who spent his days replacing air filters and patching drywall. He checked the deadbolt on his door twice before turning in each night, glanced at reflective surfaces the way other people glanced at their phones, and always chose the seat facing the entrance whenever he sat down in public. He noticed strangers the instant they entered a room, cataloging them with a glance so brief most people would never register it happening. He walked the same 3 blocks to the corner store every morning, but never in the same order twice, and he never lingered near windows longer than it took to glance through them once. His daughter, 7 years old and utterly unaware of any of it, rode on his shoulders to school most mornings, and Serafina noticed that even then, even laughing at something the girl had said, his eyes never stopped moving across the street behind them. It was the most unsettling thing she had observed so far, watching a devoted, gentle father carry a child on his shoulders, while some permanent, unshakable part of him continued scanning rooftops and doorways for threats that, as far as she knew, were not supposed to exist anymore. One evening, purely by chance, Serafina found herself at the same restaurant where Malcolm sat alone at a corner table, and she watched an intoxicated man start a confrontation with him over a bumped shoulder. Malcolm sidestepped the man's clumsy swing without throwing a single punch of his own, redirecting the drunk's own momentum until he stumbled into a nearby chair and sat down hard, humiliated but unharmed. It was such a small, precise motion that most of the restaurant missed it entirely, but Serafina had been watching closely enough to see exactly what it meant. "Are you following me?" Malcolm asked, turning toward her table without any visible surprise, as though he had clocked her presence the moment she walked through the door. "I'm trying to understand the man who saved my life," she answered honestly, no longer interested in pretending otherwise. "You don't need to understand it," Malcolm said, returning his attention to the glass of water in front of him, as if the conversation were already finished. "Were you a soldier?" Serafina asked, refusing to let the silence end the exchange the way he clearly wanted it to. Malcolm's fingers went still around his glass for a long moment before he finally answered. "Once," he said, offering nothing more than the single word. "Which unit?" she pressed, leaning forward slightly, unable to stop herself now that the door had cracked open even slightly. "Doesn't matter," he said, and the finality in his tone suggested the subject was closed for good. Before Serafina could push further, Malcolm's eyes shifted past her toward the window, and something in his posture changed instantly. The relaxed stillness replaced by coiled alertness. A black SUV had pulled to the curb across the street, engine idling, headlights off despite the darkness settling over the block. Malcolm rose from his seat without a word of explanation, dropped enough cash on the table to cover both their checks, and told her they needed to leave immediately. "Why?" she asked, gathering her coat, her pulse already climbing, in response to his sudden urgency. "Because they're not here for me," he said, already guiding her toward the restaurant's rear exit with a hand hovering near her shoulder rather than touching her, and Serafina understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the night air, that the danger from the rooftop had never actually ended. Malcolm led her through a narrow service alley behind the restaurant, moving with the calm efficiency of a man who had memorized exit routes out of habit rather than necessity. He offered no explanations as they walked, but Serafina noticed how he checked every corner before they turned it, how he positioned his own body between her and the open street whenever traffic passed. The SUV trailed them for 3 blocks before Malcolm cut through a parking structure that connected 2 unrelated streets, a shortcut no tourist or casual pedestrian would have known existed. By the time they reached a secured entrance to one of Serafina's own buildings, the vehicle had lost them entirely, and only then did Malcolm allow his shoulders to relax. "You know who they are," Serafina said, not quite a question anymore. "No," Malcolm answered, and something in his tone made the denial sound thinner than he intended. "You're lying," she said, and he met her eyes without flinching. "Maybe," he admitted, offering nothing further. Furious and frightened in equal measure, Serafina activated her private security division that same night, ordering a full investigation into anyone with motive to threaten her personally, rather than her company. What came back within 48 hours confirmed her worst instincts, revealing that an anonymous coalition had been quietly maneuvering to force her into selling off Vale Dominion's most valuable subsidiary, using pressure, sabotage, and now apparently violence to accomplish what negotiation could not. The rooftop incident, her investigators concluded, had likely been the opening move rather than an isolated accident. Malcolm listened to the findings without visible surprise, as though some part of him had already suspected the shape of what was coming. He told her plainly that this had stopped being a matter for local police, and that involving them too early might tip off whoever was orchestrating the pressure campaign before they had enough evidence to act. Serafina bristled at being given orders inside her own investigation, demanding to know what gave him the authority to direct her next move. Malcolm looked at her steadily before answering. "The authority of someone who has survived situations you have never had to imagine," he said, and the weight behind the words silenced whatever argument she had been preparing. 2 nights later, an anonymous email arrived in Serafina's private inbox, bypassing every layer of security her company had built to protect her from exactly this kind of contact. Attached to the message was a single photograph, grainy and clearly taken from an old military file, showing a man in desert fatigues whose face had been deliberately blurred beyond recognition. Beneath the image, a short line of text offered no greeting and no signature. "You should never have found him," it read, and Serafina stared at the screen for a long time before finally closing her laptop and pouring herself a drink she did not finish. The photograph unsettled her more than the message itself, because even with the face obscured, something about the posture, the build, the way the man stood, with his weight balanced evenly on both feet, was unmistakably familiar. She thought of Malcolm bracing himself against the shattered railing, of the scars along his hands, of the silence that answered every question about his past. Whoever had sent the email knew exactly who Malcolm Vance really was, and they wanted Serafina to understand that digging further would come at a cost neither of them could fully predict. She did not sleep that night, replaying every interaction since the rooftop in a new and unsettling light, wondering how deep the connection between her family's empire and this quiet, guarded man might actually run. By morning, she had made a decision that would have horrified her board of directors had they known about it. She was going to find out exactly who Malcolm Vance had been before he ever picked up a wrench in her building, no matter what the answer cost her. Serafina called in favors she had spent years accumulating, reaching out to a retired general who had once sat on an advisory panel for one of her father's earlier ventures. The old man agreed to meet her in a quiet corner of a private club downtown. His expression guarded the moment she slid the blurred photograph across the table toward him. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp in a way that contradicted his relaxed posture only seconds earlier. "He saved my life," Serafina said simply, watching the general's face carefully for any reaction. The old man studied the photograph for a long moment before setting it down and folding his hands together, choosing his next words with visible care. This man belonged to a specialized unit that operated outside conventional oversight, he explained. The kind of team whose missions were never acknowledged publicly, whose members were sometimes erased from official records entirely for their own protection. Serafina felt something cold settle in her stomach as she absorbed the implication of what he was describing. "Are you saying he was a Navy SEAL?" she asked, needing to hear the words spoken aloud rather than merely implied. "Not just a SEAL," the general answered, lowering his voice even further. "He led operations most soldiers never even hear rumors about, the kind that don't exist on paper because acknowledging them would create problems no government wants to manage." He told her that after a mission went catastrophically wrong, the man in the photograph had effectively vanished from every system that once tracked him, presumed dead by anyone without clearance high enough to know otherwise. The general described, in careful, clipped sentences, a rescue operation gone wrong in mountainous terrain, a location he refused to name even now, where a routine extraction had turned into an ambush inside of 90 seconds. Radios had gone silent. Air support had been delayed by weather that should never have grounded them. The man leading that unit had carried 2 wounded soldiers across open ground under fire rather than leave them behind, an act that earned him a commendation buried so deep in classified files that even the general himself had only heard about it secondhand, years later, from a colleague who swore him to silence before saying another word. "Not every soldier who survives a mission like that comes home whole," the general said, tapping one finger against the edge of the blurred photograph. "Some of them come home and discover the hardest part was never the mountain. It was learning how to sit in a room full of people again without counting every exit." "Why would someone with that history choose to disappear into a maintenance uniform?" Serafina asked, still struggling to reconcile the quiet man she knew with the story unfolding in front of her. "Because some men come home from what they've seen and can no longer stand being called heroes," the general said quietly, and the sentence lingered in the air between them long after he had finished speaking. Driving back toward the tower that evening, Serafina replayed every detail of the rooftop rescue with new understanding, each fragment sliding into place like pieces of a puzzle she had been assembling without realizing it. The way Malcolm had calculated the wind before reaching for her, the way he had read the failing structure of the railing in a single glance no ordinary worker could have managed. The way he had disarmed a drunk stranger in a restaurant without appearing to move at all, none of it had been luck, and none of it had been coincidence. And the realization left her both grateful and unsettled in equal measure. She wondered how many other secrets lived behind that carefully maintained silence, and whether the man who had saved her life once might soon be asked to do it again. The second attack came without warning outside a downtown conference center, 3 days after Serafina's meeting with the retired general. She had just left a closed-door negotiation session when 2 men intercepted her private security detail in the parking structure, moving with brutal efficiency that overwhelmed her bodyguards within seconds. One guard went down hard against the concrete, another was pinned against a support column, and Serafina found herself being dragged toward a waiting vehicle before she could even process what was happening. Malcolm appeared from the stairwell entrance almost the instant the situation began, and for the first time since the rooftop, the mask of quiet maintenance worker fell away completely. He moved differently now, faster, harder, every motion stripped of hesitation. And within moments, the two attackers who had subdued trained security professionals were on the ground themselves. The first man swung a closed fist toward his jaw, and Malcolm simply was not there when it landed, his body already turning, his elbow finding the soft space beneath the man's ribs with a precision that dropped him instantly to the concrete. The second attacker reached for something tucked inside his jacket, and Malcolm closed the distance before the motion finished, pinning the man's wrist against the support column hard enough that whatever he had been reaching for clattered uselessly to the ground instead. He did not use excessive force, did not linger longer than necessary, simply neutralized each threat with the calm efficiency of a man executing a task he had performed countless times before, under far worse conditions. His breathing controlled, his expression unreadable, the entire exchange over in less time than it had taken Serafina's bodyguards to hit the ground in the first place. Serafina stood frozen against the wall, watching him work, understanding for the first time exactly how many lives this man must have saved and taken in a past he refused to discuss. "How many times have you done this?" she asked once the parking structure fell silent again, her voice unsteady despite her best efforts to control it. Malcolm didn't answer directly, kneeling instead beside one of the fallen attackers to check for a pulse with the same clinical precision he had once used to check her own. The man groaned and opened his eyes, staring up at Malcolm's face with a flicker of recognition that turned quickly into fear. "Vance," the man muttered, disbelief cracking through the pain in his voice. Malcolm went rigid at the sound of his own name spoken that way. "Ghost Vance," the man added, and something in Serafina's chest tightened at the sound of the nickname, at the way the two words seemed to carry an entire history she had only glimpsed in fragments. "Don't call me that," Malcolm said quietly, his voice carrying a warning sharper than anything Serafina had heard from him before. "I thought you were dead," the man on the ground whispered, and Malcolm's answer came so low that Serafina almost missed it entirely. "Maybe I should have stayed that way," he said, before straightening up and turning away without another word. That night, one of Serafina's analysts uncovered an old piece of surveillance footage buried inside an archived military database that had somehow been left accessible through an outdated server. The video, grainy and time-stamped nearly a decade earlier, showed a much younger Malcolm, directing a small unit of soldiers through what appeared to be a hostage rescue operation in a location the footage did not identify. Serafina watched the clip 3 times in a row, transfixed by the version of him captured on screen, sharper, harder, carrying none of the deliberate softness he wore now, like a second uniform. In the footage, his voice was different too, clipped and certain, issuing commands to men twice his size who obeyed him without a moment's hesitation, and something about watching him lead in that world made her understand, more completely than any conversation could have, how much of himself he had chosen to set down when he walked away from it. She paused the recording on a single frame, where his face turned briefly toward the camera, eyes scanning the room the same way they scanned every room now, and she realized the man she had been getting to know for weeks had never actually stopped being that soldier. He had simply found a smaller, quieter war to fight instead, one measured in broken pipes and flickering hallway lights rather than mountains and gunfire, and something about that choice struck her as its own kind of courage. What chilled her most was a name mentioned briefly in the recovered audio, a name connected to a company her own father had quietly financed years before his death. She sat with that discovery long into the night, piecing together a timeline that suggested her father's fortune and Malcolm's ruined career might share a single, buried origin point. Neither of them had ever intended the other to discover. The following morning, Serafina confronted Malcolm with what she had found. Laying the pieces out across her desk, like evidence in a trial, only the two of them were qualified to judge. Her father, she explained, had secretly funded a military operation years earlier through a shell company buried deep inside Vale Dominion's financial structure. That operation, according to the surveillance footage and the general's earlier account, had been betrayed from within. Its location leaked to hostile forces who ambushed the unit before extraction could occur. Malcolm had been the one leading that unit. Malcolm had been the one who watched several of his own men die because someone with access to classified logistics had sold their position for money. He confirmed none of it directly, but his silence and the tightness in his jaw as she spoke told her everything she needed to know. "Is that why you approached me?" Serafina finally asked, unable to keep the hurt out of her voice despite everything logic told her about the timing of his arrival at her building. "I didn't approach you," Malcolm said firmly, meeting her eyes without hesitation. "I was already working there before I ever knew who your father was." "Then why are you still here?" she pressed, needing an answer that made sense of the last several days. "Because you're not the person who did this," he said simply, and something in his voice suggested the sentence had cost him more than he wanted to admit. "Do you hate my family?" Serafina asked quietly, bracing herself for whatever answer came next. "I used to think I did," Malcolm admitted, and for the first time she heard something roar beneath his usual composure. "And now?" she asked. "Now I just want the truth," he said, and in that moment, something between them shifted from suspicion into something closer to alliance. Together they began piecing together the identity of whoever had orchestrated both the rooftop sabotage and the parking structure ambush, following a financial trail that led not outward toward strangers, but inward toward Vale Dominion's own boardroom. The evidence pointed to a senior executive who had spent years quietly consolidating influence beneath Serafina's notice, a man who had once been close enough to her father to attend family dinners, and now stood to inherit control of the company if she were removed from power entirely. He had orchestrated the failing railing, financed the men who attempted to abduct her, and buried the original betrayal that had cost Malcolm his unit years earlier, all in service of a single ambition that had been growing unchecked for over a decade. He had spent years cultivating an image of quiet loyalty, showing up early to board meetings with coffee for the assistants, and remembering the names of everyone's children, all while systematically routing funds through shell accounts that traced back to defense contractors with no interest in transparency. Serafina remembered him from childhood dinners, remembered him standing beside her father at a funeral, remembered trusting him the way she trusted the furniture in her own house, simply because he had always been there. That familiarity, she now understood, had been the very thing he counted on, the assumption that no one looks closely at the man who has always been in the room. Malcolm and Serafina spent 3 sleepless nights compiling everything into a case airtight enough to survive scrutiny from a board that had every incentive to look away. On the final night, just as they finished assembling the last piece of documentation needed to expose him, every server tied to Vale Dominion's internal network went dark simultaneously, wiped clean by an attack too coordinated to be anything but deliberate. "We've been betrayed," Serafina said, staring at the blank screens in disbelief, her voice hollow with exhaustion and fury. Malcolm shook his head slowly, already moving toward the door, his instincts sharpening the way they had on the rooftop weeks earlier. "Not betrayed," he said. "Hunted." Security footage from headquarters showed Serafina being escorted from her own office less than an hour later, flanked by men she did not recognize but who wore the credentials of her own building without question. The executive behind the entire scheme had grown impatient, choosing to force her hand directly rather than wait for the evidence against him to surface publicly. He held her in a private conference room high above the city, demanding she sign documents transferring controlling interest in Vale Dominion before anyone realized she was missing. Malcolm entered the building alone, less than 20 minutes later, carrying no weapon beyond the skills that had once made him a name whispered with fear in rooms far more dangerous than a corporate boardroom. He moved through each layer of security with the same calm precision that had once defined missions the general had described as unacknowledged and unrecorded, disabling resistance without unnecessary violence, working his way steadily upward, one floor at a time. On the lobby level, he talked his way past 2 guards who recognized him from the news and hesitated just long enough for him to close the distance and end the standoff before it began. On the parking level below, he found a maintenance access panel he had personally repaired months earlier and used it to bypass an entire floor of surveillance without triggering a single alarm. Every hallway, every stairwell, every service corridor in that building was a map he had memorized without ever intending to need it. And for the first time since he had taken the job, he understood that some part of him, had been preparing for this exact night all along. But this was never simply a story about a man fighting his way through obstacles, because every step forward forced Malcolm to confront the same ghosts that had driven him out of the military in the first place. He remembered the faces of men he had failed to save, the weight of command that never fully lifted, no matter how many years passed. The reason he had chosen a maintenance uniform over any position that might ask him to lead again. By the time he reached the executive floor, Serafina had already been freed by the arrival of building security, summoned through a signal Malcolm had triggered on his way up, and the traitor stood alone in the conference room with nowhere left to run. "You could have saved a billionaire and walked away a hero," the man said as Malcolm entered the room, his voice thick, with the particular arrogance of someone who had never once imagined losing. "I didn't save a billionaire," Malcolm answered evenly. "I saved a person." The executive laughed, a brittle, humorless sound that filled the empty room. "Do you still think you're some kind of hero?" he asked, sneering at the word as though it embarrassed him to say it aloud. Malcolm studied him for a long moment before answering, his voice quieter now than it had been at any point since the rooftop. "No," he said. "I just stopped walking past people who needed help." The executive lunged for a drawer beneath the conference table, fingers closing around a pistol he had kept there for exactly this kind of last resort. But Malcolm crossed the room before the drawer had even finished opening, catching his wrist and pressing it flat against the table with enough force to make the weapon useless without ever needing to touch it. "Don't," Malcolm said quietly, and something in the stillness of his voice carried more weight than a shout ever could have, because the man beneath his grip understood immediately that there would be no negotiating a way out of this room. Within the hour, authorities arrived to take the executive into custody, his carefully constructed empire of blackmail and sabotage collapsing as quickly as it had been built. Serafina, safe and furious, in equal measure, called an emergency session of the board and the press together in the same afternoon, unwilling to let the truth wait another day to be spoken aloud. She laid out every piece of evidence she and Malcolm had gathered: the falsified railing inspection, the leaked military operation from years earlier, the financial trail connecting one man to years of quiet betrayal. When the final slide of her presentation appeared on the screen behind her, it carried a single name that made the entire room fall completely silent: Malcolm Vance. The case against the executive closed within weeks, the betrayal fully exposed, Vale Dominion's future secured under Serafina's continued leadership. But it was Malcolm the press could not stop discussing: his identity as a decorated but officially unacknowledged Navy SEAL, surfacing in headline after headline, despite every effort he made to avoid the attention. Reporters began calling him the man who saved the billionaire, a title he despised from the very first article that printed it. He wanted no fame, no reward, no public recognition for a life he had spent years trying to leave quietly behind him. Serafina offered him a senior position within her company, a title with real authority and a salary that would have changed the trajectory of anyone else's life. Malcolm declined without hesitation, the same way he had declined her money on the night they first met. "What do you want, then?" she finally asked, genuinely uncertain of the answer this time. He looked out over the city through the window of her office, the same skyline visible from the rooftop where all of this had begun weeks earlier. "A normal life," he said simply, and something in the plainness of the request moved her more than any grand declaration could have. "Do you have any idea how far from normal you actually are?" Serafina asked, a small smile finally breaking through the exhaustion of the past weeks. "That's exactly the problem," Malcolm answered, and for the first time since she had known him, he let himself smile back. In the months that followed, Serafina used a portion of her own fortune to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting veterans transitioning back into civilian life, individuals who had given years of service without recognition and returned home uncertain of where they belonged. She asked Malcolm to run it, not because of his military record, but because she understood, better now than she ever had before, that he knew exactly what it felt like to come home from war and not know how to simply exist afterward. He accepted the position on one condition: that the foundation never use his name or his story to raise money, that the work speak for itself, rather than trading on a rescue that had already cost him more privacy than he ever wanted. Within its first year, The foundation had already helped dozens of veterans find housing, therapy, and quiet employment, far from any spotlight. Each success recorded without ceremony, each name kept as private as Malcolm had once kept his own. He met with them himself whenever he could, sitting across small kitchen tables and back porches, listening more than he spoke, understanding in a way few administrators ever could exactly what silence those men carried home with them. Serafina watched him grow steadier with every month that passed, watched the guarded stillness in his shoulders soften just slightly, watched him laugh, actually laugh, at something his daughter said over dinner one evening in a way that made the whole room feel lighter. Serafina agreed without argument, understanding by then that some things mattered more to him than publicity ever could. The story that had begun with a shattered railing and a stranger's steady hands ended, months later, on the same rooftop where it started, the terrace rebuilt, the glass replaced with something stronger than what had failed before. Serafina stood near the new railing as Malcolm walked toward the elevator, calling his name once before he could disappear the way he so often tried to. "Thank you," she said, when he turned back to face her. "Don't thank me," he answered, the same quiet deflection he always offered whenever gratitude came too close. "Then what should I do?" she asked, genuinely wanting to know this time. "Never look down," he said, and Serafina laughed softly, despite herself, asking him why, in a voice lighter than it had been in months. "Because sometimes," Malcolm said, holding her gaze steadily across the space between them, "the person saving you is already standing right beside you." Their relationship did not rush forward the way stories often demand. No sudden declarations, no dramatic collision of two people who had survived danger together. What grew between them instead was slower and sturdier, built from respect that had been earned rather than assumed. Trust forged under circumstances neither of them would have chosen, but both had ultimately survived. Serafina stopped seeing Malcolm as the quiet man who once fixed a leaking pipe on the 12th floor, and started seeing instead a man who had walked through more darkness than she could fully imagine and still chosen, again and again, to reach for people who were falling. Malcolm, for the first time since the mission that had cost him everything, allowed himself to believe that a life after war did not have to mean a life spent disappearing. He found, standing beside a woman who had learned to trust him, not because of what he had been, but because of who he continued to choose to be, that maybe coming home did not require becoming invisible after all. The city moved on beneath them the way cities always do, indifferent to the storms that had passed through one rooftop and one boardroom and one quiet man's carefully buried past. Somewhere below, traffic still crawled along the avenues, lights still blinked on and off in 1,000 unrelated windows, and none of it slowed down long enough to notice that two people standing 50 stories above had just quietly decided to stop running from their own histories. Serafina thought sometimes about how close she had come to never knowing any of it, how a single gust of wind, on an ordinary evening, had somehow led her to the one person capable of understanding both her loneliness and her armor. Malcolm thought, less often but more deeply, about the men he had once carried across open ground and never gotten to explain himself to, and found that standing beside someone who had chosen to trust him anyway made the weight of that memory a little easier to carry. Neither of them called it love in the beginning, not out loud, not for a long while, but it lived in the small things, in the coffee left on her desk before board meetings, in the way she started leaving the office early enough to watch the sun set from the rebuilt terrace, instead of always chasing the next deal. But high above the noise, on a terrace rebuilt stronger than before, two people who had both nearly fallen stood together instead, finally unafraid to look down.